Okay, we're going to get started now. My name is John Lowe. I am CEO of AppGuard, a provider of cybersecurity software, securing critical assets around the world. This call was put together for a variety of reasons, primarily to connect people with direct access to accurate information about what's going on with COVID-19. The world right now is facing an unprecedented challenge. Um, we have health concerns, economic concerns, and what is new about the situation is we have information overload. There have been far more, well, it would appear far more devastating health challenges to the world, but never have we been subjected to 1 billion health experts on social media, each giving their opinion about what is happening, how to protect yourself, and what will happen. So what we've done to try and address that is to eliminate the media from being a filter, so that you can hear information directly. We've assembled an incredible group of speakers today, each who can address the health, economic, and security implications of what's going on. I want to thank the sponsors of this webinar. As I mentioned, AppGuard is a sponsor. AppGuard has been busy protecting people working from home. We're in an unprecedented situation where large enterprises have been forced to have their workforce dispersed. We're busy protecting them. The American Defense Institution is with us today. ADI provides a comprehensive array of services, including government relations, program development and execution, and strategic consulting. We're also supported by IronGate Capital. IronGate is a fund that invests in advanced technologies that strengthen the national security of the United States. Big Media is a sponsor. Big Media is a producer and distributor of television programming around the world, primarily documentaries. And we're also getting great support from the Legion organization, which is a self-defense and counterterrorism training program for civilians, and the Field for Truth organization, which focuses on disseminating accurate information to as many people as possible. Those are the organizations who are supporting the call, but neither I or those organizations are necessarily the experts, but the people you're going to be hearing from are the experts. We don't believe in taking people who are novices. The people on this call have one goal and one goal only, and that is to give you accurate information about what's going on. The panic that is spreading around the world is probably more dangerous than the virus itself, and we'll hear about that. So our first expert today is Dr. David Gangemi, noted virologist who was the team leader at Fort Detrick Biosafety Level 4 facility. At Fort Detrick houses the Army's main institution for defensive research into countermeasures against biological warfare. What does that mean? That means that Dr. Gangemi has more knowledge about this subject than 99.999% of the people out there, especially the Facebook warriors. So this is going to be great. Van Hipp Jr. is the chairman of American Defense International. He's the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Army, and is a frequent commentator on news channels around the globe, and is often cited in some of the biggest news stories for current events, including the COVID-19 crisis. Hamlet Youssef is the president of IronGate. I mentioned what IronGate does, but Mr. Youssef has extensive national security experience and is a former U.S. government foreign service officer. Joining these three experts is John Mullen. Not only is he a senior vice president for national security at AppGuard, he's a former assistant director of CIA and oversaw operations in Asia. Some of the information that is reaching the American public and the Western public is intentionally wrong. So there are security implications to the COVID-19 crisis. So with all that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Hamlet, who is going to moderate the conversation. Thank you, the four of you, for being on the panel. Hamlet, please take it away.
Great. John, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for all the sponsors for this, and also AppGuard for putting this on. Appreciate the opportunity to chair this great panel. I'm going to do what every panelist should do, which is talk very little and let the experts speak. But as John mentioned, our goal here collectively is to provide you all with ground truth, intelligence, and information that's factually based. We're trying to strip out the hysteria. We're trying to strip out the politics of this and give everyone, as they say, just the facts. Some of the facts may be pretty blunt. Some of the facts may be refreshing, but we want to make sure that we help filter out some of that noise we're seeing out there. We're going to structure the call basically focusing on three areas. We want to give you all a general update on COVID-19, what the disease means, how it's spreading, and just give you the hard science and medicine around that. We're going to then shift and talk about some mitigation strategies of what we all need to be mindful of. What can we do at home? What can we do in terms of self-care and healthcare? And also, what are some of the things that our governments, both at the state and federal and coordinated international level, are doing to address this? And then the last part of it is get an understanding of the security implications of what we're dealing with and how to get smarter in terms of what's happening, and what is the news that's being given to us, what's factual, what's not factual, and what are some of the things we need to worry about from a cybersecurity standpoint. So, having said that, I'll begin with a general overview on COVID-19. And with that, Dr. Ganjemi, with your background, if you can kind of walk us through an update in terms of what we're facing here in terms of the virus, and talk about the virology of it, how it's spreading, and what are some of the things that we need to be concerned about.
Thanks, Hamlet. Let me just quickly give everyone a review of a few key aspects of the virus and the current pandemic as we know it. A little bit on the virus itself. Coronaviruses are RNA viruses with a unique envelope spike, which actually looks like a crown, thus the name coronavirus, when these viruses are observed by electron microscopy. Now, these spikes are the components of the virus that allow it to attach to specific cells in the lung and cause the pulmonary problems that we now see. These viruses are relatively stable, and they can stay active for hours in aerosols or on inanimate surfaces. Now, the name of the disease is COVID-19, and the name of the virus is SARS-CoV-2. And that's the virus for the current outbreak. And SARS stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome. We're going to talk about that in a little more detail. But there are three coronaviruses that have caused serious disease outbreaks over the last 20 years, and each caused this severe acute respiratory syndrome. The first is SARS 2003, which had a mortality rate of about 20%. The third was MERS, or Middle Eastern Respiratory Virus, which occurred in 2007 and had a mortality rate of up to 30%. And of course, the latest one, the one we're dealing with now, is SARS-CoV-2, which is the novel coronavirus, but it's called SARS-CoV-2. It has a mortality rate of anywhere from 1 to 5%, depending on the population infected. And as most of the audience knows, individuals over 70 and those with diabetes, COPD, or other underlying health issues are at greater risk. And the mortality rates are higher in these populations. Now, the dynamics has led to a heightened precautions in nursing homes and in the use of telemedicine to aid in diagnosis. Telemedicine has come on strong here lately, but protecting the elderly in nursing homes is most important during this time. There are other coronaviruses which are also present, and they're with us right now, but they're much less pathogenic and are among the most frequent causes of the common cold. So in the midst of the coronavirus that causes this pandemic, there are others that are causing less severe disease, such as the common cold. Let me give you a few thoughts on epidemiology and transmission. Again, as many of you know, the epicenter for the current COVID pandemic was Wuhan, China. It probably started through the consumption of exotic bushmeat, and in particular bats. Bats are the reservoir for these viruses, and consumption of bat soup or smoked bats may have given rise to the current epidemic. Airborne transmission through droplets or small particles give rise to high transmission rates. Now, the virus favors colder temperatures and low humidity, and this gives us hope that the virus circulation may decrease during the hotter summer months. However, there is still much concern that the virus will likely return next fall. On average, the incubation period is approximately 5.2 days after exposure before symptoms appear. The unfortunate part of this infection is that many individuals never realize that they are infected, and asymptomatic cases allow the virus to spread at unprecedented rates. The virus in these asymptomatic cases can remain with individuals and can be excreted even though the individuals don't know that they've got the virus. Now, worldwide, there are more than 250,000 cases and over 10,000 deaths, most from the outbreak in China. However, there are more than 40,000 cases in Italy, with over 3,500 deaths in Italy, and Italy has now become the new epicenter of the disease. Surprisingly, there appears to be more than 40 to 60-year-old infected individuals requiring hospitalization. And this is a frightening statistic, since in most other parts of the world, it's the elderly and those with underlying complications, immunocompromised in particular, that most are affected by the virus. But this fact, the fact that 40 to 60-year-olds are infected, has led some to suggest that there might be a different strain of virus circulating in Italy. But this is still under investigation, and no one has defined whether or not this is indeed the case. But in the U.S., there are currently more than 14,000 cases and over 200 deaths. But this number will dramatically increase over the next several weeks before the incidence curve begins to flatten out. The worst case scenario is that up to 40% of the population could be infected. But I think a more reasonable and conservative estimate is that the infection rate is going to be probably around 10% of the population. Compared to seasonal flu in the U.S., currently there are more than 370,000 hospitalized and more than 25,000 deaths due to the seasonal flu, the H1N1 virus or the H2N3 virus. Now, these numbers will also dramatically increase over the next several months. Regarding prevention, slowing traffic into the U.S. and mitigation procedures such as social distancing has helped to contain the virus. We probably need to continue these practices for at least another month. The vaccine is being developed, and NIH is helping with other commercial players to produce a vaccine, but it's still a good 12 to 18 months away. But let's hope that it may be available for next year's outbreak and will be given along with the flu vaccine. As far as treatment strategies go and the new developments in that area, antiviral drugs such as remdesivir, which is a drug that was used for Ebola, and chloroquine, which is a drug that's used for malaria and has been used for many years, are now under evaluation in China. The data so far demonstrate that when combined with traditional antimicrobials such as Z-Pak or azithromycin, it looks like they have great promise in working together as a cocktail in decreasing disease progression and virus shedding. We're going to hear much more about this combination over the next several weeks. Other therapeutics that are out there and being developed, such as monoclonal antibodies, are now close to approval by the FDA and will have an immediate impact in therapy and prevention of infection, particularly in at-risk populations and healthcare providers. One of the things that we don't think about are all those healthcare providers that are in the immediate line for infection. We have to be sure that we do something to help them not get infected. I think with that, Amit, let me stop and we'll go from there.
No, great. Appreciate it. That was a great, concise overview. Van Hip, if we can switch over to you real quick, if you want to expand on your background and experiences in terms of managing reactions from a U.S. military standpoint. What do you, and John, I'll pose this question to you as well. What do you see as far as the rollout and reaction that we're hearing in terms of what the federal government and the state governments are doing in response to what appears to be two critical hot zones, New York, California, and potentially Washington?
My background formerly served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army, and particularly specifically had the mobilization piece, which include our medical mobilization aspect. You may have seen General Lingle today, the National Guard Bureau, saying he didn't want to see the National Guard federally activated, but let the governors have it because each state's a little different. The big thing, I think, I've long been an advocate for the use, as Dr. Jimmy was talking about, the use of antibodies and therapeutics to combat the coronavirus until a vaccine is ready. Dr. Jimmy is right. It's going to be at least a year before we have a vaccine. So having the antibodies and the therapeutics, when we get to the mitigation part, I'll talk more about chloroquine and some things that have happened there the last 48 hours and some reports that we're picking up from all over the world. But getting the antibodies and the therapeutics, the ability to treat it now, I think has got to be the top priority. The ability to provide early treatment for the coronavirus to those most susceptible to infection, the healthcare workers, the elderly, those most recently infected, I think that would be a game changer. And you're seeing a lot right now over the last couple of days. You see the president cutting through a lot of FDA red tape. And a lot of this, like the chloroquine thing, I think has been driven by the media because people were not getting the response they needed. And the president, I think, is rightfully said that we're going to do away and cut through the red tape of these bureaucratic rules. I talked to one doctor this week with an old cancer drug that has shown great promise. He called up the NIH and they said, and he already had the safety data because it's been used on patients with cancer. And the NIH told him, well, we'll put it in a monkey and write a paper and come back and see us in a year. That's the kind of stuff we've been having to fight. But I think the president's making the right decisions. And the real challenge, I think, is this: the innovativeness, the ingenuity we need, where these antibodies are in America. It's mainly with the small businesses, many of them that the leadership is not aware of, the small companies. We found out this week that you have an American company that actually has antibodies to coronavirus now in an FDA manufacturing facility. I understand a national TV crew is on the way to that facility today. So I think Dr. Jimmy is right. We're going to see a lot happen over the next couple of days and the next week. And I think the story is going to be the innovation is with small American business. That's how we're going to win this thing. That's how we're going to turn the tide. It's going to be with the small American businesses. And I think we'll be looking back on this and say, how do we change that whole NIH, FDA framework so that we're able to respond quicker in the future?
Okay. I got a couple of questions. I'll get back to you on this one. John Mullen, with your background over at CIA and your experience in East Asia, how do you draw parallels in terms of what you're seeing, what you've seen with President Xi's reaction and messaging on how he's handled this case? I think he just wrote a book on his lionized performance compared to what the Chinese did in some of the outbreaks we've seen come out of the Middle East. I'm sorry, out of Asia in the past.
Yeah, it's a fascinating situation. I think people are focused on Chinese attempts at disinformation to claim credit for their performance in China and the allocation of blame for the origin of the virus to the United States, or at least implying that that's the case. I think there's two audiences the Chinese Communist Party are looking here, and particularly Xi Jinping. One, obviously, foreign interlocutors kind of stirred doubt in the minds of some of our allies and friends around the world that maybe we're responsible for this. And it's deflection. It's taking the heat off the Chinese government for their slow response, their shutting down of critics when whistleblowers, and their muting of the press internally in China that would have saved us collectively about 7 weeks as getting ahead of this virus. I think the other thing that people tend to forget is there's an internal audience he's very concerned about. Whatever Chinese leader, whether it's Xi Jinping or Hu Jintao, have traditionally been very concerned about the internal audience. When you've got a developing situation, phenomenal success in their economy, no question, over the last two or three decades or so, but you've got haves and have-nots developing, with a significant portion of the population living on $3 or $4 a day. So a lot of migrant workers and so on. So there has been for years a concern about a tipping point where a confluence of events, not any one thing like a virus, but maybe a confluence of events, tips the apple cart and presents the security and military forces there, the internal security apparatus, with a situation that overwhelms their capacity to respond. That has been a concern for years, and we've seen that manifested over and over again. So I think he's doing it for a combination of reasons. To what effect, we don't know, but I think it's important for us to push back on that where appropriate, while protecting the rights and safety of Americans of Asian descent, because if we muddle that message, they will have succeeded, and we don't want that. I think another player there that's capitalizing this, obviously, are the Russians, who are out to destabilize the United States in any way, shape, or form they can, whether that's interfering in our elections or spreading disinformation about this, or instigating, potentially the Russians, denial of service attacks on HHS itself, and some of the people trying to resolve this issue. Closer to home, I think, getting back to Van's point, what we've seen is a gradual rollout of conflicting signals and messages by state and local governments here. I live just outside of San Francisco in the Bay Area, closer to Sacramento. And earlier this week, the governor had imposed, by legal writ, a shutdown on all activities in 5 or 6 counties around San Francisco. The epicenter of the outbreak here in California has been primarily centered in Santa Clara County and San Mateo County, the heart of Silicon Valley. So kind of looking at that as an outset, people have been shut down from work. You can't go outside of your home unless you've got a legitimate medical activity, an appointment of some sort. You got to visit a pharmacy or you go get food. There are allocations being made, or allowances being made, I should say, for people to go out and exercise, walk their dog, as long as they maintain 6 feet apart from each other. But the interesting thing here is that was imposed by the governor in one part of California. The mayor of Sacramento, former state assembly leader, imposed a less binding legal set of guidelines for similar activities here in Sacramento a few days ago, and that message was thoroughly muddled. People couldn't make heads or tails out of it. Reno, just across the border state line up here in Nevada, their mayor recently shut down everything, akin to what had happened in the counties surrounding San Francisco proper. And then you've got various other county and municipal leaders around California kind of with a mishmash of measures to try and protect their population. So I think this lack of clarity on the messaging, what you can and can't do, inhibits a lot of Americans intent on doing the right thing with doing just that. They don't know whose orders to believe. Those with different kind of circumstances that don't fit neatly into the categories I described, having to go to the doctor's office, for example, the pharmacy, or to buy groceries, have other questions that have been answered to a certain degree by certain authorities at certain times, but under different legal authorities. So that's a confused issue. And I think from a state perspective, just speaking from state legislatures and the governor here and other governors I've heard based on public comments, they decry the lack of a cohesive federal government response on this. Whether that's fair or not, I'll let you be the judge. But the fact is, as you noted, the situation varies greatly in different parts of the United States. People in Montana, for example, are facing a far less severe current situation than those in New York and Washington State. So you got to allow some room for people to adopt different measures given the circumstances on the ground in their area. But the lack of any kind of cohesive message from the federal government, in their view, has complicated matters.
Okay. So is this, and I'll let you or Van opine on this one. So is this a case where when it comes to coordinated mitigation strategies, the best solution, would that be some sort of a clear overarching direction set at the federal level and then allow the independent United States, i.e. the local governments and leaders make their decisions and execute this in a coordinated fashion where it's not a decree from the king, but all the different states and municipalities within a pretty close, tight window would mimic similar actions, so you don't have one state or one city on lockdown just to have your neighbor running amok?
This is Van.
Yes,
I'm sorry.
go ahead, Van.
No, you go, John.
No, I think that's accurate, and I base this judgment on recent comments and interviews by other state governors, including the 3 in charge of the Governors Association nationwide and others. But I think they're looking for some general overall division of labor and clarity in that, what the federal government's responsible for, what they're going to deliver, and in the state and local governments. I think President Trump was unfairly, sharply criticized right off the bat the other day for suggesting the governors should do whatever they need to do in terms of acquisition of respirators and other things. But the governors are faced with a situation, but under the act that the president just signed, a Korea War era act that allows the Defense Department to kind of commandeer resources and direct organizations to make hardware necessary for a crisis like this. There was some confusion about how do we go about doing this. So I think that the criticisms are flying in both directions to a certain degree, but I think the truth lies somewhere in the middle. The solution does. So I think striking that balance is necessary, but I think it'll start with the federal government's kind of clearly delineating what they expect the governors to do, and the governors kind of acknowledging that they have to do the following things, but expressing, I think, in more unified fashion what exactly they need from the federal government.
Okay. Great.
Yeah,
Van, yeah, go ahead.
I think that's the right framework that you and John both espoused. I think we're seeing it, and it's kind of analogous to what we're seeing with chloroquine right now as from a mitigation standpoint. Doctors have been given it. They're not waiting on the FDA. The doctors themselves have been able, even though it's not approved treatment for coronavirus, it only is for malaria, doctors are given it. However, what the president did yesterday, he basically ordered the FDA to approve it as to test it as a coronavirus treatment. And so what's happened as of yesterday, University of Minnesota began a test 1,500 people using chloroquine. And the dean of the medical school there said, this ain't going to take months, it's weeks. They're moving quickly. But here's what's significant. We are hearing a lot of good things all over the world on this. And I've got there are 3 doctors in Norway. I think this is significant. One of whom is actually from Wuhan, China, but lives in Norway. And over the last, I would say 45 days, they have done a tremendous job getting intel out of China, what was really going on, how successful chloroquine was and is. And they have gone public with that to the Norwegian authorities. They sent me a copy of it last Sunday, Hamlet. And if anyone on the call wants it, I can get it to you and you can forward it to them. It's very significant. Chinese have ramped up production big time of chloroquine. And now it has been added officially as part of the treatment guidelines. Norway today, I believe, is now officially adding it to its treatment guidelines. University of Queensland in Australia came out just a few days ago, infectious disease experts there, and found that it actually disappeared in infected patients, a number of them. France, and this is getting a lot of play. France had a study out that just came out a couple of days ago out of their big infectious disease university in Marseille, saw a significant decrease in the amount of time COVID-19 patients remain contagious when given it versus those who weren't. South Korea, Belgium have now all added it to their treatment guidelines. And here's the biggie: the United Kingdom. Over the last month, the United Kingdom has now banned the export of chloroquine. Why is that significant? Because it's getting tough in the United States to get it. I spoke to a physician yesterday in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He wants to prescribe it for patients. Drugstore's out of it. Spoke to a doctor in Austin, Texas yesterday. They try to go to the drugstores to prescribe it for patients. They're out of it. I've got an op-ed on Newsmax today talking about this, and I call for basically two things. The fact that we've got to ensure an adequate supply of chloroquine now for the American people, and I believe we need to follow Great Britain's lead and ban its export. And if you can't get chloroquine, my good friend Dr. Jimmy is on the call. He said, well, man, just have a couple of gin and tonics because it's got the quinine in it.
Vodka tonics do the same trick.
Okay, I'll tell my wife, Dave, because she likes that.
So the run on toilet paper after this call is not going to expand to gin and tonics and vodka tonics. Bringing it back to the personal, Dr. Jimmy, I wanted to give you a chance to talk about not only the remedies you're hearing out there, but until that stuff comes to market, what can we as individuals be doing during this social distancing and self-quarantining phase?
Well, I do think that the social distancing aspect here of how we're trying to control the spread of the diseases is the most important part of this. I will add, however, that the teaching of more about the virus and how it's spread is very important. The millennials are key in all of this. Right now, there are many, many millennials that are infected with the virus who don't know that they're infected, so-called asymptomatic infection. But they carry the virus and they spread the virus. And they can carry it to mom and dad, to grandmom and grandpop very, very easily. They have to be aware that they really do play a key role in containment of this virus. Many millennials, of course, don't believe that either they can be infected or will spread the virus, but in fact they are, and they're key contributors to the spread of the virus. So social distancing is very important, and in people like myself who are older than 70, it is extremely important to be aware of not getting into large crowds, trying to do other things at home that will keep you away from the virus. So that is very important. Education is another key aspect to all of this.
Okay. You mentioned a couple things I wanted to key on here as well, just keeping it down at the personal level. On the contagion piece and how this thing spreads from individual to individual. Obviously, bodily fluids, sharing the same food and meal are all high risk. But can you help calibrate the hysteria around aerosol and this thing being spread through community spread? So if I'm walking down to Publix and I grab for a carton of eggs or a can of peas or whatever, and somebody else had with the virus had handled that prior, what is that community spread contagion really look like? What's the aerosol risk look like?
Yeah, for sure. Aerosols are the most efficient way through which this virus is being spread. It's been shown that when people sneeze, this virus can stay viable in the air in very, very small droplets. It can stay active for many hours. The droplets, the larger droplets, will fall to the ground and aren't quite as much of a concern. But it's these fine aerosols that are really important to be aware of. We can overplay this whole concept, though, of washing hands and aerosol exposure. If you go to a supermarket, for instance, early in the morning here in South Carolina, they decontaminate the supermarkets and they open them up to the elderly very early in the morning. And as long as there aren't any individuals that are sick in that store, there is very little chance that you're going to breathe in any of the virus and get infected via that way. However, in a movie theater or in a shopping mall, it can be very different, and the aerosol route of transmission can be the most common cause of getting the virus. As far as the virus landing on surfaces, if someone has been in a shopping center and sneezes and the virus lands on an inanimate object, on a metal rod or on cardboard or on cloth, the virus can still be spread, but it's much more difficult to spread it in that way. Those are called fomites, and it's very much more difficult to spread in that way. However, it can be spread. Washing of the hands is a simple procedure, and yes, if you touch those fomites and then touch your eyes or your mouth, you can get infected. But by far, the most prevalent way of spreading the virus is in the air, in aerosolized virus that is present after a sneeze. But it can also be present, I have to emphasize this, in those millennials that don't even know that they're infected. Even their breath, even if they don't sneeze, their breath can contain some of the virus and they can transmit it. And so it's very important for them to be very aware of this virus and how it's spread.
Okay. So it sounds like the biggest threat here, and this is probably why we're seeing such a vast, hopefully or potentially a global move, is from a social distancing standpoint. If you start cutting out highly congested spaces where people are very close proximity to each other, breathing the same air, ill or not ill, symptomatic or asymptomatic, that in your estimation is our single biggest defense to let this virus kind of burn itself out before the cavalry arrives with treatments, antibodies, and vaccines.
It is indeed, Hamlet. It is indeed. Social distancing is our greatest friend right now.
Okay, understood. Switching gears a little bit here on this one. This is something that John, you and I can discuss here a little bit. I think you touched on it earlier, is information. I think we've seen, especially obviously in this information age, be significantly weaponized, and disinformation be used to shape the narratives by adversaries. Foreign influence is something that's been there since the beginning of warfare and espionage. But I think what's happened over the last couple of years is social media platforms and the interconnectivity of the world, and the way we're very tribal in where we get our news information. What advice would you give some of the folks here in terms of how to ingest the noise and understand what's going on out there? Because depending on what news website or blog you follow, what's a symptom, what's not a symptom, what's safe, what's not safe, how do you filter through that noise, and to what extent do you see that that disinformation being used against us?
I think one of the keys to kind of differentiating between pardon me, the noise and the real kernels of information you need to rely on to make decisions for your family and your companies is you have to consider the source. I, over this past weekend, had received several messages from friends in a church nearby that were concerned about reports that there'd be a lockdown on all activities in the United States by the president, and that we'd see something akin to what was going on in France or Spain with government measures imposed there, but on a far more draconian level. It turned out that was part of a Russian disinformation campaign. I didn't know that at the time, but I said, well, consider the source. Where'd you hear this? Well, I said, we got it from a friend, and he got it from a friend. Be very wary of that. Even bloggers will tend to take an undemonstrated or a story or provenance of a story with the provenance of which is confused or muddled, and write articles based on that or blogs based on that. Be very careful of that. I'm not saying all bloggers are bad, but you got to be careful about taking things at face value. I think the best thing to do is people don't like this in the United States. They distrust authority. Listen to what your state and federal leaders are saying. The media will help you establish media outlets, a variety taken together will help you get a clear picture of what's going on. And it will prompt others, including those in the media and experts like we have on this call, to start asking questions that hopefully will clarify exactly what they're trying to drive home in terms of the messaging. But I think above all, the lesson of any intelligence officer comes into play here: consider the source. Know who your source is, look at the background, look at their track record, make decisions based on that.
No, that's spot on. I think we tend to chain letter news that we hear. So I think vetting obviously becomes a critical component. It's funny how you mentioned the disinformation piece, because I think one of the things we're seeing is some of the same infrastructure that was used to help manipulate thoughts in elections is being bantered about as a potential source of some of the disinformation that's coming in as well. This is, I guess, a question for you and Dr. Gangemi, talking about the veracity of a source and track record. How much should we rely on the numbers we're seeing coming out of China and Iran, which are pretty stark, versus the numbers we see coming out of Italy, eventually Spain, and then ultimately the US?
I'd have to say that the information coming out of Italy is very reliable, and the WHO has a lot of control through its interactions with the Italian government and looking at the actual data that's coming out of Italy. Italy is the new epicenter, as I mentioned, and let's just hope that there isn't a different strain that's coming out of Italy that's causing a greater rate of infection in that 40 to 60 age group. But I think Italy is doing the appropriate things to control the situation there. As far as Iran goes and China, a lot less validity or faith in the information that's coming out, particularly out of Iran. I think that there's probably, and many others think, that there's probably a lot more going on right now with respect to infection frequency in Iran. China seems to have a handle on the outbreak, and I think CDC now has built some relationships with China, and I think there's a greater believability in the current data that we're seeing. The curve appears to have flattened in China and may actually start coming down in the next several weeks.
Okay. Based on my rough arithmetic, it sounds like Hubei province, for the most part, has been on a pretty harsh or pretty strict lockdown for a better part of 4 to 6 weeks, and they're just now starting to come back online. If things continue to hockey stick up in Italy, obviously they are. Spain looks like is going that way. We sure looks like we're going that way right now. If there is a massive nationwide series of shutdowns, is 4 to 6 weeks a realistic expectation, or do you think it might be shorter than that, longer than that, or too early to tell?
Probably too early to tell.
Okay.
But I think that 4 to 6 weeks is optimistic.
Okay.
I think it's going to take longer.
Okay. Understood. So that puts certain stresses, I think, on obviously people. If you're spending 4 to 6 weeks working remotely, working out of your house, there's obviously some psychological strains. We're not going to get into the business of how to manage personal stresses, but I think one thing that we're starting to see as a key pressure point is going back to the adversarial attack vector on this one. We're starting to see a significant uptick on attacks from a cybersecurity standpoint, both potentially nation state backed, but for sure organized hacker groups that are not only attacking websites and HHS, but we're starting to see greater uptick in terms of attacks on devices, because as more and more people are working remotely, you have more vulnerable infrastructure. John, what advice would you all have for small business owners, financial advisors, people who are forced to work from home? What are some basic safeguards that they need to have in place in terms of protecting their device, protecting their communications infrastructure, and some best practices from a cybersecurity standpoint.
I think that you start with the fundamentals here. People say this all the time. You'd prevent about 80 to 90% of your cybersecurity problems just making sure that your patches are up to date. Those with iPhones can automatically update key apps on your phone, validated through Apple and our App Store. Similar with other vendors, they do a pretty good job of vetting people that are putting applications and whatever on their platforms. But an easy way to do that is configure your iPhone or your other devices such that they automatically update, so you don't even have to worry about that. But if you don't do that, you render yourself liable or vulnerable to an attack that takes advantage of vulnerabilities in former versions of software already out there on your phone, on your laptop, on your desktop, or wherever. That's number one. The other is, depending on the sensitivity of what you're doing at home, you can consider getting a virtual network established. There are ways of doing that. Various companies do that. They're all available on the web. But I think it's basic hygiene. And I think Americans also, the one fundamental piece of advice I give them is I never trust any particular platform. There are password management solutions. I use 1Password. It's just one of many available. But people get confused. But you can use strong passwords, store them in that device with one master password, usually a sentence or a phrase, not a word, to open it up, and you'll have access in an encrypted form on your cell phone or on your computer to various strong passwords used for each and every different account you have.
Mm-hmm.
I think at last count, I have over 110 passwords for banking applications, emails I use, and so on and so forth. It's easy to do. But if you don't do that, I think hackers, criminal and state actors, have demonstrated their ability to kind of go back on information in the past, dig up a password or a phrase or a segment of a password you tend to use with regularity and leverage that to their own advantage. So some of the basics, especially as more and more people are deploying to home.
Okay. Well, it sounds like cyber hygiene, cyber best practices, verify and vet, which you also talked about in terms of news and official updates, is kind of the way to go to make sure you're locking yourself down. That's great advice. So we're getting pretty close here to the top of the hour. What I want to do right now is I think we've posed out some of the questions that we had coming in. I'm sure there's a lot more. Unfortunately, we can't get to every question. I'm going to give you all each a couple of minutes, some closing comments. For me, I want to thank John Lowe and the team at AppGuard for giving me the chance to participate in this panel and moderate this. Dr. Ganjemi, Van Hip, it's a pleasure working with you all, and John, great serving on this panel. For me, I think key takeaways here is we're not out of the woods. We're, I think, basically just entering in the woods. So we're going to have a long slog ahead of us, having the right outlook and the right attitude, and working the problem sets that are put up in front of us, I think, are going to be critical. I think everyone's a little miffed in terms of what happened to their net worth over the last couple of months or last month with the slide in the stock market. I'm a pessimistic optimist, or an optimistic pessimist, I guess, somewhere in between. I think the wealth destruction that we've seen and some of the instability that we have coming ahead of us is part of the creative destruction of capitalism. I think there's going to be some companies and some ventures and some endeavors that are going to get built out of this. I personally have my faith in the American people, the American spirit, and more importantly, free markets and capitalism. I think some of the points that Dr. Ganjemi, John, and Van hit on, one of the key nodes is I think there is going to be private sector innovation that's going to play a part in this. Everything from helping us get to a cure and a vaccine to technologies that make us more efficient and more sane as we're working from home, and from a cybersecurity standpoint, and from a security standpoint, technologies that are created at the entrepreneurial level. I'm a big fan of that. That's one of the areas we focus on as our fund. But on the on specific to COVID, I do think the private sector is going to come to the rescue. And I'm seeing and hearing too much chatter and noise out there for me to think otherwise. But real quick around the horn, Van, we'll begin with you, and then John, and then Dr. Ganjemi, And then John Lowe, you can close us out. Closing comments and key takeaways for our folks here. And just keep in mind, I think we have over 500 people that are registered for this call, and it's a mix of industry professionals, civilians, folks in government and whatnot. So what will your final parting words be?
Great, Hamlet. As far as the stock market's concerned, I'm going to go with what old Coach O said. I don't know if you saw Monil Kavuta the other day. He said he's got a lot of money in there, but he doesn't blink, and America's going to come back. But yeah, the key takeaway, I believe, is we've got to focus on antibodies and therapeutic to combat the coronavirus until vaccine's ready. If we can do that, I think it's a game changer. It turns the tide. And I think critical to doing that is we do need to get the military docs more involved. And I'm not just talking about primary, from a primary care standpoint. The military infectious disease research that they have done for years and years is unparalleled all over the world. The Military Infectious Disease Research Program, the United States Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Disease, these are the leaders. These are the people who have been out there pioneering for years on dengue, Zika, Ebola, and they have done remarkable work. They need a seat at the table. And I think it can help really be a game changer. There's a big difference between the military docs and military infectious disease folks and some of those in the civilian sector. They move a lot faster, and they're focused. They're kind of, they would subscribe to what President Trump did yesterday, cut red tape. They're about saving lives today. So I think that's a key point. And you talked about telemedicine. Absolutely. There again, who made telemedicine a reality in America? The United States Army Telemedicine and Advanced Technology Research Center. Go back and look at it. The best platforms in America today came out of the United States Army. And the American Telemedicine Association yesterday did a fantastic webinar on telemedicine right now that can help physicians, hospitals, American people. And I will get you the link. They recorded it, Hamlet. I'll get you a link to that for anyone who's interested. And lastly, I'll say this. We did get one question came into us from a Dr. J.T. Shim in Florida, and his question was, should I watch the movie Contagion or should I watch Outbreak? I'm going to leave that to Dr. Gangemi since he was loosely portrayed in the movie Hot Zone, which the movie Outbreak was based on.
Absolutely, Outbreak.
So Outbreak's the more accurate one?
It is indeed.
Great. John, any closing comments before we turn over to Dr. Gangemi?
I think it's important for everybody on the call and people they supervise, either at work or co-supervise with their spouses or significant others at home, to differentiate between facts and speculation. There's an awful lot of speculation right now out there, a lot of it uninformed. I go back to my comments about consider the source. Your federal, state, and local authorities do their level best to give you the facts. Sure, there's political spin involved there, but you compare notes between different press outlets that are respected in the United States. Clearly, some have different overall political tendencies than others, but you round out your reading there, and you get a pretty clear view of what's going on, and the questions being asked by the press are usually informative and helpful. I would say I get back to Hamlet's kind of overall message. I have great faith in the American economy to recover. It's done several times in the past. I'm old enough to remember the stock market crash back in '87, and obviously the Great Recession and people's panic then. And I think if you look at the fundamentals right now, our economy was going gangbusters up until about a month ago. You can argue that our response was muddled and delayed. I would tend to agree with that, but that's no one individual's fault. I think that's a collective failing of organizations and entities here in the United States writ large. But the point here is our food supply is secure. We're producing more than enough food. The hoarding is something I don't understand. It's irrational in many regards. I think our government officials are doing their level best to kind of unmuddle the issue, make their guidance clear and consistent for different Americans, taking into account the special circumstances in places like New York, Seattle, and others hardest hit by this. But we'll get through this. We always have, we always will. But I think as a population, there's reason for hope, but in order to maintain that and fuel that hope, you got to differentiate between Facts, as I said, and speculation. A lot of the latter is harmful.
Excellent. Thank you. Dr. Gangemi?
Yeah, let me just echo what John has really just said, and this too will pass. We just need patience, and we need to do what the health officials at CDC and NIH are telling us to do. They have got great feelings that these individuals that are there and these organizations are going to contain this virus. I think the mass hysteria and the panic which we're now seeing is just part of our human nature. And really the fear we see today is not unlike that observed during the 1918 Spanish flu and the 1978 swine flu pandemics. In the coming weeks, we're going to see new antiviral therapies and really great progress on vaccine development. The rate of infection will level off in the next 6 to 8 weeks, and by summer, we will see a dramatic reduction in infection rates. The containment measures currently in place are really our greatest friends and should be taken very seriously by all.
Great. Well, thank you all. John Lowe, floor is yours.
I'd like to thank all of the panelists and our great moderator, Hamlet. And I want to thank everyone for tuning in. It should be noted that the panelists and even myself are all self-isolated. It's really important to, as John Mullen said, take the source of your information into account. There are over 500 people who registered for this. You will all be emailed a link to a recording of this, which you should feel free to share with friends and family. Each of the people on this panel have been consulted by major media and by the government about this issue and other issues. They are experts. Listen to them. The media has an interest in keeping you glued to the television and the internet. So take what you see and read there with a little bit of a grain of salt. And as Dr. Gangemi said, the best thing you could do right now is to really isolate yourself, and things will eventually get better. We will get through this as a nation and as a world community. So on that note, I wish everybody on this call and your friends and family and coworkers, I wish you all good health, stay safe, and stay tuned for more information. Thank you all.
Great. Thanks all.
Thanks.